Hello, everyone. A new episode, a new day, a new episode of Tekken Talks podcast. I think number five, maybe number six. This episode is a more of a theoretical episode, and less so a practical slash concrete conversation, because there's a lot of different opinions on this topic, and I think a lot of different viewpoints, and all pretty valid. I think it just depends on how you view the game. But we're gonna kind of go over, I think, both a professional player's one, namely speed kicks, and then my own, and just kind of compare and contrast these different views of the game. So what we're talking about is how many options, I guess, or what are your choices in Tekken in a given, in the imaginary neutral range one, like this start, maybe not start of the round, but like this weird imaginary situation in Tekken where you have the most possible options, right? So, how many quote unquote options do you have in this situation? Obviously, let's just say what we're not talking about. So, we're not talking about when your opponent does a minus 12 move and you block it. That's not really what we're talking about because I think it's understood and accepted that the best thing to do in that situation is to punish the move, right? Yes, there are some cases where that might not be the best thing you want to do, right? If my opponent does a a hop kick and I'm playing Kazuya, I might hell sweep them. Like I know it sounds crazy because you can also get the knockdown with back 2-1 or with 1-1-2, but you still might hell sweep them for a mind game or for just something, right? But for the most part, your options are not, they're not limited, but it's accepted that there are clear options that dominate other ones, right? So punishing is a pretty much dominant accepted move, right? If you had a perfect player, you expect that they would punish the move in that situation. 99 times out of 100. So what are we talking about? Well, are we talking about the start of the round? Are we talking about range 3 Tekken? Because so someone said on Twitter something like, and this was a reply to speed kicks. I'm not like criticizing speed kicks. I'm just stating what happened and like I think we have a different opinion on this issue. Someone said like, uh, oh yeah, you expect me to know the 5,426 options in this scenario. Let me just have some water quick. And speed kicks was like, no, there's really like 70 options. And I'm pretty sure, unless he was being pretty cryptic, that he was referring to his move list or to the move list of a character. If not, I mean, that might be a strong assumption, but saying 70 sounds a lot like the number you would say of viable moves on a move list, right? So if your average Tekken move list is between 90 and 110 moves, you have multiple versions of throws, you have crazy, pretty garbage moves, and you get to about 70 moves that are like legitimately viable in most situations, especially in like neutral situations. So that's kind of what I took that as. And so, are we talking about range 3? I don't think we're talking about range 3 neutral because, I mean, one, I think there's a debate if you should ever be in range 3 neutral. Um, I mean, it depends on your character, but my personal opinion is that if you're in range 3, quote unquote, neutral, then you're wasting time and you're wasting space unless you're running away. So, like, situational, but like, if you're trying to do a mind game at range 3, it's probably a lot of wasted potential. But anyway, so I don't think we're talking about range 3 because most of your moves are just going to whiff, right? Most of your moves are just going to whiff. There's not that much incentive, from my point of view, on whiffing a big move at range 3. Like there's some incentive of like whiffing a jab maybe or jumping backwards, just something to see how angsty your opponent is. I think Ace Unlimited, the gym player, would sometimes jump backwards at range 3, and I'm guessing it's just to either mess with the opponent or to see how angsty they are, right? If you jump backwards and someone's trying to like whiff punish your jump at range 3 or something, you're like, oh, I learned something. I have some new information. But so then what are we talking about? Are we talking about range 2? 2.5? When you start getting into like, oh, my long range whiff punisher might hit. So once you get into range 2, you really have this like, okay, I can probably launch them if they do a big whiff. So I can probably launch them if I do a big whiff. So I guess my options start to get a lot more, right? Because just from a move list. So we're just talking about move list, right? Which I think is again what Speed Kids was talking about. I don't know this again, imaginary scenario. And it sounds purely offensive. So it's like a purely offensive like move list. Again, if I'm misinterpreting that statement, then my bad. But I don't think that there was enough information for me not to misinterpret it. But anyway, okay. So then we have, let's say, three or four long range whiff punishers. We're gonna have a long range knockdown whiff punisher. We're gonna have a long range launch whiff punisher, and then we're gonna have two maybe medium-ish damage with punishers, and then we're also gonna have run up jab, which I'll consider one option, right? I'll consider run up into a really fast punish as a range 2 with punisher. So we have like 5 defensive. I know I said offensive, but call those defensive options. Offensive options probably still don't have that much, right? Not many characters. I mean, there's like Claudio. There's like Claudio with running 2. Uh, yeah, there's just not a lot of characters that have like ranged King forward 1 maybe that have like forward momentum will close the distance at range 2 to start an offense or to fish for something. So and naturally at range 2, that's when your counter hit options also start to come into play. So again, from an offensive slash partially defensive button option, just button option, we're at like what, like 20 things? Maybe 15, maybe 20 is too generous. 15 from this perspective. So from the perspective of offensive buttons slash starting to get into whiff punishment. Okay, now let's bring it in a little bit further, but not too much, and let's see how our options expand. Now we're at range 1.5. Isn't this an interesting range? Most characters do not have access to a jab or down forward 1 that will reach at this range. Most characters need at least a 14 frame move to 14 frame move to reset this range, or a faster move that's really meant for punishment, right? Or not meant for punishment, but like a pretty punishment oriented game. So like Katarina forward 2, yeah, that's 13 frames, but it's really a punishing. You're not just going to throw out forward 2 in neutral. It's a high, it's minus on block, it's not very good. You'd have to expect the launch, but so you do have like, and I mean, now you also get into like range low poke range. So like Zafina down back 1+2. Kunimitsu sweep. I think this is like prime Kunimitsu sweep range, like tip range. You have a Kuma down 4 range. So now you start getting into like low options. You have Law's slide at this range. Law's slide at range 2 is a thing, and it's actually but you're not really throwing it out for a mix up. So like slides at range 2 are, you throw them out, and I think this is true for any character. So like even like Nina's slide, you throw them out so that they're just a safe option at that range, because it's likely that your opponent's moving. So if your opponent sidesteps or sidewalks either direction, it's most likely that they're going to have a much more difficult punish if they avoid your slide than if it's a mix-up situation. Because like we know at range 2, these characters don't have mid options really that are going to hit you. So it's really just that I want the safest low I can do at the time. So range 1.5, we start getting to actually like threatening lows. I think like king forward forward neutral 2 starts to become an option. This is when I also think keep out counter hit moves start to really become things. So like Brian 3+4, Armor King's host of slowish kind of counter hit moves. All of Leroy's arsenal because he just has such good range, except for maybe Black 1+2. So now you start. So I think range point 1.5 is when you really get like, again, from a purely move list perspective, your offense starts to really open up. So now you're at like what, 50 moves per character that are viable in this range? Viable meaning assuming your opponent is standing still and blocking, that they will hit, or that you're forcing them into a mix-up situation. And I don't know if you can tell by my tone and how I'm doing this. This is kind of, I'm starting to build up the argument that I actually think it's not 5,000, but I'm building up the argument that I don't think it's just limited to your offensive move list, right? So let's just say we're in range 1 to 0, right? So 1.5, you have like your counter hits, your keep outs, your more risky low pokes. Range 1 to 0, you have your whole move list essentially. Again, the viability of these different tools is not what we're talking about, right? Because that's very situational. So like you might say, jabs are good at range 0, but my keep out move isn't good at range 0. Well, maybe, but again, that's a play style and mind game situational thing. But so now we're at range 0, so we have access to our full move lists. In other words, nothing we do will whiff if the opponent's standing still and not doing anything. And I think that's how, I guess, speed kicks derived the 70 number. I guess. So let's say we're gonna go ahead with the assumption that that's the case, right? If that's not the case, I really don't know how he got to the 70 number. Like, is that the average of your offensive, defensive, mental mind game options, movement options, all combined into one, and then like averaged across the cast? I don't really. So we got to go with the assumption that it means like offensive move list. Okay, let's actually start introducing another perspective and start building up how many options I think you have, or how many permutations of these options that I think you have. So first assumption we have to get away with, or move away with, is that Tekken's a purely turn-based game. Naturally, on a computational level, on the level of the computer and the processing of Tekken, it is, right? You have 60 frames per second. According to the computer, that's the rules. So technically, it's a purely turn-based game with simultaneous turn taking possible, right? If you both do something on the same frame. But to humans who, don't operate in this way, I'm going to call it a continuous space game. So no, it's not quite as continuous as, let's say, an FPS, where your movement is also computationally pretty much continuous, right? Like your angle and your orientation in game is going to be represented by a pretty big floating point number, right? So like dot dot, you're at position 1.57888, and that's pretty much continuous. Where in Tekken, yes, ranges, you're going to be at different ranges. I think it's easy to argue that for a human, Tekken is a continuous time and move domain, right? So continuous time as in, we don't perceive the game as if it was slow motion, one frame, next frame, next frame, next frame. We perceive it as a continuous kind of like video. And continuous action, as in the implementation, right, ranges, like you can be at any different range with very minute differences. Your health can be in any, like, between 1 and 170 times the range. So this is all different spaces, right? So your health could be at a certain point, you can be at a certain range, the time can be at a certain time in the match. So for a human, I'm going to just call that continuous space. So it's not discrete. So it's not like tic-tac-toe or even chess, right? It's not where chess is a very clear turn-based game on a discrete board, which for those who are interested in AI at all, that is why we're able to make chess computers that were really good before we're able to make StarCraft computers that were really good, AI that was really good, because chess is what's called a discrete action space game. So right, there's very clear moves you can make. And again, I think it's Tekken it's similar, but I think it's slightly more complicated. So then what's next? So how does that factor into how many options you have? Well, as a human, I'm going to say, for me, a move combined with movement can be done in a way that is fast enough where I consider that one option. In other words, I believe that knee, for example, so even the best players in the world can do a small enough sidestep into a button to the point where in their mind they did not perceive the sidestep and the button as two separate things. I think they're physically capable of doing that. Now, I'd have to ask them, like, is that really the case? But I mean, for me, at least at my lower level, that's true, but on a much bigger scale, right? So I can't do this micro sidestep into a move and be like, oh, that was one choice, but I can do a large sidestep into a move. And for me, that was one choice because I'm not as good as them, so I can't think as fast as they can. So then let's say, okay, so for every situation in this move set, we can do sidestep left, sidestep right into a move. And we can cancel that sidestep in, let's say, 30 frames, or maybe 20 frames. So at any point in that 20 frames, we can cancel that sidestep into a move. And let's say doing that is, for the most part, one decision. And again, we're still assuming that our opponent is standing still. So then what do we have? We have 2 times 70 plus 70. So we have 70 times 3, 210. So now we're at 210 options, right? So I'm going to sidestep left, sidestep right into the move in a speed at which I personally perceive as being one motion. And again, I think this is true at any level because I think your hands can ultimately move faster than your brain can say, I'm going to make this super calculated choice. I think the super calculated choice might be like you're sidestepping. Now, the other perspective on this is that the sidestep into a button isn't an action. The sidestepping is just changing the state of the game per se, but it's not an action. That's a weird perspective since it's the player who causes the sidestep. But you can imagine if I'm just always sidewalking, then me pressing a button is not sidewalking plus button. It's just I was in the state of sidewalking. So you can make that distinction. But again, I don't see where there's evidence that the segmentation is happening in decision making when a pro player does, or when a top player does, like literally taps up into a button. I don't see how you segment those per se. But again, maybe but not everyone's a top player, right? That's the other thing. The other thing is, for everyone, not everyone's gonna have the reflexes of Ulsan, or the processing or the brain processing power of Ulsan. And that might not be a question of even how good or bad you are. That just might literally be a question of your um, biological speed at which you can do this. So then we have 210 options. Now let's include a backdash into that. Again, your opponent's standing still. So your opponent's standing still doing nothing. So you can do a backdash into a button. So we're at 280. Now, let's just assume the opponent's still standing still, but now let's assume a different action space. So we had the action space of directions on your controller plus an attack plus a button. And that came up with like this already, like you're in the hundreds of options. Again, with time, the truth is that is already in the thousands, because the precise timing at which you combine the move and the button, or press the button, again, is gonna be part of the decision. And we already know from research that, for example, Super Mario Bros. Melee players are not playing frame by frame. They're delayed by about like 6 or 7 frames mentally, just because of human reflexes. And so it's really not a frame by frame thing. It's really more of a continuous thing over a course of a period of time, and you can make decisions within that time frame. So really, I think we're already in like the low thousands. Again, if you really want to take this move list and then extrapolate in the way I'm doing it. So then we're in the low thousands of options. Now let's say, okay, what if I don't want my action to be a move-based action? What if I want my action to be a mental mind game, a mind game-based action? So what if instead of thinking, I'm looking at my move list, what can I do? I'm thinking of my strategy. What's the strategy I want to employ here? Or what is the mind game I want to get across in my next decision? So maybe that includes 2 moves. Maybe that includes 2 moves to get that mind game going, right? Let's say I'm going to do a jab into a stature kick, and I make that as a single decision because I know I need this mind game to be going of, I just did a high into a low. You gotta duck that low next time. Like, I want to initiate that mind game. That's my choice. Well, that's a string of 2 moves. And it's a string of 2 moves pretty fast that's an option you can do. And we're assuming your opponent's not moving. So you can make that decision and you could get counter hit in between the jab and stature kick. But you had made that decision that you were going to do jab and stature kick before you knew you were going to get counter hit. So isn't that a decision in itself? Are you really going to say, no, I decided to do a jab. Then in the 10 frames of my jab, I made the decision, I want to do the mind game of a stature kick. Again, maybe this is true at the highest possible level, but not everyone has to be a pro player. And I do also want to make a point about like validity of these opinions, just in case I know the Tekken community can be pretty toxic with this, but just because you are a good player or a world-class player, even in Speedkick's case, does not mean like your opinion is automatically truer or more valid than someone else's about the game. And again, I think this is a conversation where many opinions are valid. So there's not one right answer, but right, like an example could be, before Stephen Curry in the NBA, there were a lot of old school players who were like, no, you can't shoot that many threes. Shooting that many threes is not good basketball. Like, that's not a good option. And naturally, Stephen Curry like proved them wrong. Like, no, actually, this is the way of the future. Or there's pretty much any example where top players aren't always right about something. Like, that's just how it is. I'm not saying Speed Kicks is wrong. I'm just saying it's valid not to agree with the top player's opinion. And I think the community, the Tekken community, would be really healthy if like that was just an accepted thing, I guess. Okay, so the next thing. Right, never forget, Nee thought Akuma was B-tier. That's the classic. No one knew outside of Pakistan, for the most part, how ridiculous Akuma was before Pakistan showed everyone. Okay, so we're at what, like a few thousand options, lowballing with the time, the action combo with your opponent standing still, um, and then what? And then we introduce the mind game tactics aspect where we're stringing together moves and movement to create a mind game. It's not infinite, but it's not even too large when your opponent's standing still and is like not doing anything, and you have no past experiences with the opponent. So you know nothing about the opponent, um, except for like basic possible mind games, so like high, mid, low mind games. Boom, you're already. Let's just lowball it and say you can combine each one of your moves with a jab. So you can do jab into any one of your moves, and that's another option. So then you're at, another 70 plus. Maybe you can do a -1 move into any one of your other moves as a decision. It grows and grows. And again, the reason why I'm emphasizing your opponent standing still is because if your opponent's not standing still, you have all of these options, plus you have to consider your opponent's options, which in one sense restrict your own options, because if you have a hard read on what your opponent's going to do, you're going to limit what you're going to do to try and counter that. But in the other sense, if you don't have a read on what your opponent's going to do, that adds exponentially onto what you have to think about. And you're not playing against a training dummy. So you can't just wait for moves and then know how to counter it in the perfect way, because they are able to initiate mind games also. And again, the timing is just such an underrated aspect of this. You're playing in a game you have so much time to make different decisions. I think one of the differences when you watch really good players versus, again, maybe not so good players is, or not so good, it's all relative, but when you definitely watch pro players, there's so much less wasted time, right? They're making decisions so much quicker, and they're still going to 0 0 seconds on the clock. And I think a lot of this is because the timing of your decision adds to the complexity and adds to the number of options you have. And so in conclusion, I guess, one, you're okay. It's okay to have an opinion or feel overwhelmed by the number of options, because there's a lot of them. And part of getting quote unquote good at Tekken is the process of limiting those options. That's part of how you improve, because as a human, you're not able to process all of those options and consider all of those options in the 1 second interaction that you're having with your opponent at range 0 to 1.5. So a lot of it is just narrowing your options. I mean, if you want to see the ultimate narrowing of options, watch Nee play any character that's not one of his main characters. He does 5 moves. He does 5 moves. And he uses timing and mind games as his options. He's not even operating in the move list of options. So the idea that the move list is your options, I think, again, that's a valid opinion. You can have that, and I think that's probably true for many players. But for many players, it might not be true. For many players, when I play Steve, I mean, yeah, back one and down forward one are my options. But that's not what I'm thinking about at all. I'm thinking about timing and mind games. When I play Fang, hell yeah, I'm thinking a lot more about move choice because I got a lot of moves that are pretty valid and pretty good decisions in a lot of situations. So I think it varies a lot, and this variability is also part of the game. Um, so yeah, just don't. So yeah, that's my take. I'm not going to give any advice. That's my take. The last takeaway I'll say from this is so yeah, right. So in conclusion, I think Tekken is a pretty continuous space game. So you don't have infinite options, but considering who you're playing also and the novel mind games and the way you can use Tekken as a medium to communicate, you have pretty near infinite options, especially as you expand your horizon on what an interaction is. So if your interaction's like half a second and range was 0 to 1.5, they're relatively limited. I think in the order of thousands. I don't think what that person said on Twitter was wrong. But if you say 5 seconds, okay, I can choose in 5 seconds what I can do. I think you're getting it grows exponentially. I think you're getting near infinite levels again for a human, which is why I think most players don't make decisions on a scale of 5 seconds. Partially because they don't know how their opponent's going to react, partially because you just have too many options in those 5 seconds. Um, so yeah, that's my take on that. The last thing I'll say to conclude this episode is just a note on kind of uh, kind of communication with and like I I I just want to say it's okay to complain or not like something about the game. You do not have to. Also, I just like to point out a lot of players, top players who do complain about the game are not the best player in the world. So even that is weird. But you do not have to make top eight at an international 300 plus man, 250 plus man master event to have an opinion about the mechanics of the game or to want the mechanics of the game to be changed. Tekken was not made by gods. It was not made by some metaphysical being, and it's not some religious truth. This was made by people that are, for the most part, still working on the game, as far as I know. And you're allowed to say you don't like something about it or think a part of a game is not, because otherwise, if that's not true, then there's no limit, right? There could be a game where it's like, okay, your your controller has 7,000 buttons and there's a trillion scenarios and you're not allowed to have a criticism or not allowed to say that's not what I personally prefer. And no, you shouldn't just shut up, but rather it's okay to say it because um you could say I still love Tekken. I still love, for the most part, I love the all these other aspects of Tekken. Oh, I want this one thing changed. That's fine to have. It's a fine opinion to have. Communicate it. It doesn't mean you're trash if you have a certain opinion about a game. Um, naturally there is a point where like if you did just start playing and that and you don't like everything, then it's the time to play another game. But if you spent hours and hours playing Tekken and you're just not a top eight international level competitor, and you say I don't like this aspect of the game that much, I think crushing in this case should be consistent, or I think it should be less consistent, or I think frame data should be more variable or less variable. Like that's okay to have as an opinion. Communicate it, voice it. You know, all the above. Anyway, thank you for listening. Let me know what you thought of this episode. You can find my Twitter and the link in the description. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a great day.